right. Thank you everyone for being here with me again for Spreedly's Payment Dialogues. This time I have actually one of our own on the dialogue with me. I'm going to be talking today with Shoresh, who works here at Spreedly on the data science team. So it's great to have you on, Shoresh, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I am the only data scientist at Spreedly, and I have joined Spreedly and been here for the past 2 years, analyzing data, helping the internal team, and doing all kind of exciting stuff.
So tell me, so data science, it's a huge term. Lots of people are throwing it around these days. I think different organizations, it means often very different things. So tell me a little bit more about what data science means at Spreedly and what your job kind of entails.
Right. Well, at Spreedly, we have a lot of data. For example, we know a lot about transactions, the amount of transactions, the currency of transactions, the date where the transaction took place, or if the transaction went through, or if it was declined. We know a lot about the gateway that processed this transaction. We know about, for example, the latency rate. And we also have a lot of stored data about payment methods like credit cards and debit cards, what brands they are, if they are a MasterCard or they are a Visa or Discover, what is their expiration date, and also what bank issued these cards, and other data like that. Not only we have internal data, but we also have access to extensive external database. Like, for example, we use bank identification number or BIN database. And also for the industry data, we use databases like the one in Crunchbase or DataNice. So the data science team leverages this data in three main categories. One, we are helping our internal team by providing insight in fields like, for example, we work on cohort analysis, we do some customer segmentation for outbound marketing, or we do some lead scoring. In the second main category, we actually help our customers. Sometimes our customers are expanding to a new region and area, and they want to know, based on the real data, what are the best performing currencies in those particular regions or areas. But at the same time, sometimes customers are thinking or considering picking gateway A or gateway B, and we do some analysis. We make some performance comparison between these two or multiple gateways, and we allow them to pick the best based on what suits them.
Gotcha.
The third field, and the third main category, which is my interest, I'm really excited about this, is the opportunity to do research and publish articles. So because of the data we have at Spreedly, we identify the problems in the payment space. We try to translate these problems to data problems, and we try to tackle these problems with the data that we have in Spreedly. The past 2 blog posts about, for example, decline rates or credit cards versus debit cards are a result of these studies.
Gotcha. Just real quick, what's your favorite blog post or analysis that you've done so far at Spreedly?
The first one at, I think, early 2017, which was about decline rates, and if between credit cards and debit cards, and if the credit cards are worth their processing fees. It got a lot of attention. I really worked very hard on that blog post, but I did not expect this much attention. And it was really, really exciting to see that people actually read it a lot. We had a lot of visitors, a lot of conversations around that blog post.
Yeah, I remember that. It was really cool. You touched on a lot of different topics that data science deals with. And what I'd love to do is kind of dive in on one particular topic. So you mentioned specifically that sometimes we help customers do analysis of different gateways performance, maybe because they're going to switch or they're going to add a new one. So when you think and I know you've recently been doing some analysis on the value of using multiple payment gateways and having access to multiple payment gateways. So I'd love it if you could kind of talk me through what analysis you've done on using multiple payment gateways, and why a company might want to use multiple payment gateways.
Yeah, first let's take a look at what people talk about one versus multiple payment gateways in literature. There are a lot of studies, a lot of work that people actually have published online, and they talk about the advantages the advantages of, for example, using multiple versus one gateway. The main obvious reason is globalization. When you are moving and when you are expanding your business and you are moving from one region to another region, and you need the support for a particular currency that your current gateway does not support, you need to think about, for example, using other gateways. The second thing is the cost. In some currencies and some areas, using some gateways are less costly and more economic for your business. The other obvious reason that people talk about in literature online is basically the technical reasons. It happens, and it has happened in the past, and it will happen in future, where where a particular gateway just shuts down or underperforms in a particular currency. So it's better to have a safe backup. The other reason is where people talk about is flexibility, where you actually give your customers choice. So sometimes you are working with other merchants, and these merchants are already using a gateway or currency that you don't support. That's why you need to add another payment gateway or gateways. And at the same time, sometimes you want to allow your customers use multiple or different payment methods. And because of that, you need to, for example, when people have PayPal accounts and they want to use their PayPal, you need to provide the right infrastructure, the right gateways in order to process those payments. The other things that some people talk about is things like, for example, backing up the data by using multiple payment gateway to make sure that your data is safe if whatever happens for one particular gateway.
Okay. So, so out of all those different areas or folks, things that people talk about, I'm really curious, like, what your perspective is after having done analysis inside of Spreedly's data set. Like, which are the ones of those that actually matter, and which are the ones that are maybe, I mean, we've had these discussions before. I know a lot of times you're like, well, I can't tell you for sure because I'm a scientist and I'm just giving you, like, these are just hypotheses that we're testing. But I mean, your best guess as you look at these different things out of the Spreedly data or what you know so far, which of these actually matter, which may not actually be of import?
Well, to answer this question, I actually looked at the data that we have in the past couple of months, and I extracted about around 100 million transactions. Around this, among these transactions, about 70% of them are purchases and 30% of them authorizations. We extracted about 90% of the domestic transaction, and 10% of this data are international transactions. And we found that, for example, our customers have used about 114 different gateways for processed transaction in 106 different currencies. And we decided to do some further analysis and take a look at for example, how do these gateways do with regard to decline rates, and at the same time, how is the latency of these gateways when they are processing transactions, for example, authorizations, transaction or purchase transaction, domestic transactions versus international transactions. And obviously, before we start digging more, I need to point out that payment gateways are only one part of the payment infrastructure, and there are many players in this area. So it was a statistic a couple of probably years ago that was published, and it was shown that about 44% of decline rates happening due to the insufficient fund in customer's card. So that has nothing to do, for example, with the payment gateway processor. But at the same time, when you're looking at this data, I think we still can identify some trends for the gateways, something that hopefully you'll find it insightful. One of the things that I can, for example, talk about is that we realized that on average, gateways process transactions in 6 different currencies.
Wow.
And yeah, and so despite the fact that the top gateway process transactions in about 96 currencies, what is important is that we should note is that 50% of these gateways transacted in only 1 or 2 currencies. And in fact, 48 gateways transacted in only 1 currency. So if you are using one of these 48 gateways that are transacting in only 1 currency, and you are thinking about expanding you definitely need to consider other options or using multiple payment gateways.
Yep.
At the same time, currencies do not get the same share in the gateways. For example, US dollar is the most popular currency among gateways. The gateways are transacting, about 85 different gateways are transacting in US dollar. But we have for 50% of the currency that we looked into, 3 or less gateways are processing in those currencies. And I should note that when I'm talking about currencies here, in particular, I'm talking about successful transactions in currencies. So if we have a handful of gateways where they are making a couple of unsuccessful transactions, and I did not take them into account.
Right, right. I mean, because if you can't transact in the currency, you can't transact in the currency. So, so as you go and you break all these down, I mean, do you think maybe this to ask this question is to answer it. It seems like there would be some bias in Spreedly's data set just because we started out as a U.S. company. So in terms of the U.S. dollar centricness of the data set, how much do you think that sort of affects the output of your analysis? And then I'm also curious about, if you kind of look just at the non-US dollar transactions, how does that shape up? So thinking about a US company already transacting in US dollars, but then going internationally and needing to start transacting in other currencies, it's really kind of a different evaluation than evaluating US dollar success rates.
Well, the good news is that when I'm talking about international versus domestic, I'm not talking about a US dollar versus other currencies. We actually have this ability to find the international and domestic transaction and each currency. And when I'm presenting you these numbers, this is the aggregate of all currencies. That's true that our customers mostly, for example, transacting US dollar, but the analysis is correct for all other currencies because we have this ability to take into account domestic versus international transactions in those particular currencies as well.
Yeah. Are you doing that via bin analysis?
Yeah, it's a bin analysis. So if our customers are interested in, if the audience are interested in knowing how we do this, basically we map the currency of the transaction with the currency of the country of the cardholder. So for this, we have our own database, we have bin database, and we also have some other external databases where basically they give us, for example, the currency versus the country. The trick here is that there are some countries that all of them are using one particular or one currency. So we need to be careful about that. But again, I want to actually remind you that when you're talking about international versus domestic, it's not only about US dollar, it's about all currencies, your international and all currencies, domestic transactions.
Right. And just real quick, can you tell people what a bin, like what a bin actually is?
Bin is just a bank identification number. Based on the first 6 digits of your credit card, we can learn about the credit card brand. We can learn about the credit card issuing bank. And also we know about the type of the card. For example, if you are using a classic card versus a reward card versus a travel card and stuff like that. So the first 6 digits of credit cards are stored in a database that are called bin, and bin provides this type of information that I mentioned.
Yeah, cool. So going back to thinking about, how does your analysis sort of directly impact a company who's thinking about, for instance, expanding from the US into other countries? Should they be considering other currencies? Should they be considering other gateways?
So when you take a look at the data that we have, we actually broke the analysis down into 4 parts. First, we wanted to focus on, for example, purchase and authorization. And at the same time, we wanted to focus on domestic versus international. So in case you have 4 different categories: domestic purchase, domestic authorization, international purchase, and international authorization. What we found out was that if one particular gateway is, for example, doing a fantastic job in domestic purchase, they do not necessarily doing a great job in domestic authorization or international purchase. So we hope that the outcome of this analysis will help organizations to actually think about optimizing their payment processing experience.
Gotcha. And then beyond currency, what did you find any other factors, or have you been able to analyze any other factors that impact sort of using multiple gateways, or why companies would want to do that?
Well, aside from the other factor that I mentioned about, for example, globalization or shutting down, a gateway shutting down technical issues, or gateway not supporting particular currency areas, we have another factor, which is basically latency. And in Spreedly, we define latency as the time between submitting the information to a gateway and hearing back from them. And basically, when you're talking about latency, it obviously takes into account the processing time required for gateway and the payment processors to process the payment. And those two are not separated here. But at the same time, when you're looking at the trends, we can get some interesting information about those latencies. Why latency is important? Because the amount of time that you really need to hear from the payment processor is important. For example, if you're processing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of transactions in a short period of time, the latency becomes very important.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the data show in terms of latency? Do gateways vary?
Right, absolutely. So again, based on domestic, international transactions or purchase versus authorizations, it varies. Not only it actually varies, it varies also for one gateway in different type of transactions or that I mentioned. At the same time, there are anomalies that we observed. We noticed that some gateways are actually getting better over time. When we looked at the data in the past couple of months, some gateways are getting worse. I want to point out that when you're talking about gateway latencies, we're talking about the time in the order of seconds. So in the past couple of months, we have noticed some gateways are actually improving, for example, from 3 to 4 milliseconds to 2 milliseconds, and some gateways are actually moving the opposite direction. And sometimes we actually can see gateways shutting down, or they are dealing with some technical difficulties, because for some period of time the latency doubles, triples, and we can identify the problem with the gateway through identifying those anomalies.
So I guess my next question would be, why does latency matter? How does it actually affect, beyond obviously merchants who might, for instance, have on sales and need to push a lot of transactions through all at one time? I think there the impact of latency is pretty clear, but is there any kind of correlation between latency and success and failure, whether a transaction is going to ultimately succeed? How are those related?
That's a statistical question that requires some analysis. I have not done that, but actually I was thinking about it this morning. But the other thing is that when you are actually processing payment, your merchant, whoever is using basically your system to make a payment, when your customer is waiting for seconds and seconds and seconds for processing their payments, it actually is an unpleasant experience. And my guess is that it lowered the conversion rate, or it actually lowers the retention rate for the customers to come back again and do the same purchase again.
Right. So it's almost, I think we could pretty clearly tie it into a brand effect, right? Where it reflects poorly on your brand if you're regularly taking really long times to process transactions. Right. Regardless of maybe that particular transaction gets through, but you lose the next one.
Right. Imagine someone on eBay are purchasing things on a daily basis, and every single time they have to wait a couple of extra seconds to basically for the payment to process. The unpleasant experience will probably think some of them to consider other alternatives.
Yep. All right, Shoresh. Well, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you talking through this. I have a hunch we'll have future payments dialogues about other analyses that you do. You're always churning out interesting topics to talk about. So thank you everyone for watching Payments Dialogue again with us here at Spreedly, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Shoresh.
Thank you.